There was a sound that every British street used to make. A small bell above a door, ringing every few minutes all day long from early morning until the lights went off at night. If you grew up anywhere in Britain before the 1990s, you know that sound. You probably haven't heard it in years. And here's the unsettling part. You probably didn't notice the day it stopped. This isn't a story about nostalgia for its own sake. This is the story of how one of the most important institutions in British life disappeared so slowly, so quietly, that nobody rang the alarm. There was no closing ceremony. No headline that read "Britain's corner shop has died." It simply thinned out, street by street, town by town, until one day you drove past where it used to stand and there was a vape shop there instead, or a charity shop, or nothing at all but a shuttered window with old tape marks still stuck to the glass. We're going to walk through exactly how this happened. Not with vague sentimentality, but with real numbers, real dates, real names, real laws passed in Parliament that most people never even read about at the time. Because what happened to the corner shop wasn't an accident. And it wasn't really about taste. It was the result of decisions made in boardrooms, in government offices, and in millions of ordinary British kitchens, decade after decade, that nobody quite added up until it was already too late to stop. Here's what nobody tells you. The corner shop didn't die because people stopped loving it. It died because something colder, more efficient, and frankly far less human, simply won the fight. And the most painful part of this story isn't even the closing of the shops themselves. It's what quietly disappeared along with them. A kind of trust between neighbors built over years that does not really exist in the same way anymore, no matter how many convenience stores still sit on Britain's corners today. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time when the corner shop wasn't a nostalgic memory playing in your head while watching old footage. It was simply how Britain lived, every single day. In the year 1900, something close to 80% of all the food bought in Britain passed through the hands of an independent shopkeeper. Not a chain, not a faceless company, a real person, standing behind a wooden counter, who knew your name, your family, and quite often, your secrets too. By 1950 that figure had dropped, but not by much. Independent grocers still sold 54% of all the food in the entire country. More than half the nation was still being fed, quite literally, by someone they knew personally. One of those shopkeepers ran a small grocery in a market town called Grantham, in Lincolnshire. His name was Alfred Roberts. You may not recognize that name immediately, but you will absolutely recognize his daughter, Margaret Thatcher. Long before Downing Street, long before she became the most powerful woman in British political history, she was a girl helping in her father's shop, learning how to weigh out sugar, how to balance a ledger, how to deal with customers who came in needing more than they could pay for that week. That detail matters more than most people realize. The corner shop wasn't some quaint sideline of British life sitting at the edges of real history. It was the foundation underneath it. Politicians, factory workers, vikers, school teachers, almost everyone in Britain passed through a shop just like that one, regularly, for the basic business of living. But underneath that foundation, something was already beginning to shift, and it was about to move far faster than anyone expected. In 1948, just as rationing from the war was finally starting to ease, something genuinely new appeared on a street in Manor Park, in East London. A grocery shop where you didn't ask the man behind the counter for each item one by one, the way it had been done for generations. Instead, you picked items up yourself, off open shelves, walking the aisles, and paid for everything together at the end. It was opened by the Co-op, and it became the first permanent self-service grocery store in the United Kingdom. It sounds almost too small to matter. A different way of moving around inside a shop. But this single change was the seed of absolutely everything that followed. By 1950, Sainsbury's had opened its own self-service branch in Croydon. And once the big names in British retail saw exactly what self-service shopping could do for speed, for volume, for profit margins, There was no putting that idea back in the bottle. In 1950, there were only 50 supermarkets in the entire country. 50 in the whole of Britain. By 1961, that number had exploded to 572. By the end of the 1960s, it had passed 3,000. Pay close attention to that timeline because it tells you something crucial about how this story actually unfolds. This wasn't a slow, gentle fade happening over a century. This was an avalanche that started small and became almost unstoppable within barely 20 years. If this kind of detail is the sort of real British history you enjoy, now is the perfect moment to subscribe. Because we're piecing together exactly how modern Britain was shaped, one overlooked decision at a time, and there is much more of this story still coming. Meanwhile, the family-run corner shop was still everywhere you looked. In 1970, there were roughly 90,000 independent grocery stores across the United Kingdom. 90,000 small shops, each one a daily stop for the families who lived nearby, each one part of a street's rhythm, the same way the post arriving or the milk float passing by were part of that rhythm. You went to the corner shop because your milk, delivered in glass bottles that you'd later leave out, washed, for collection the next morning, would spoil by tomorrow if you didn't use it. You went because the meat from the butcher needed to be eaten fresh, wrapped in grease-proof paper, and then an outer layer of plain paper, with no plastic film involved at all. And this is where we need to talk about something that changed everything quietly, almost invisibly, sitting in the corner of the kitchen rather than on any high street. The fridge. By 1968, only about half of British households actually owned a refrigerator. Half. Today we genuinely cannot imagine a kitchen without one, but in the 1960s buying food was still mostly a daily ritual rather than a weekly chore squeezed into a Saturday morning. You went to the corner shop because your milk, delivered in glass bottles that you'd later leave out, washed, for collection the next morning, would spoil by tomorrow if you didn't use it. You went because the meat from the butcher needed to be eaten fresh, wrapped in grease-proof paper, and then an outer layer of plain paper, with no plastic film involved at all. The shop wasn't an errand you scheduled. It was simply part of how each ordinary day was built. Once refrigeration became standard in nearly every home, something invisible but enormous shifted underneath British daily life. Food stopped being something you bought daily and started becoming something you stockpiled weekly. And the moment shopping shifted from daily to weekly, the corner shop's single greatest advantage, sheer convenience close to home, began to lose its grip on people's habits. Around the same time, car ownership in Britain was climbing rapidly too, doubling from around 2.4 million vehicles in 1951 to 5.1 million by 1961. A family with a car and a fridge could now drive once a week to a large supermarket on the edge of town, fill the boot, and not need to think about food again until the following Saturday. That combination, fridge plus car, quietly dismantled the daily logic the corner shop had depended on for generations. But there's something else happening at almost the exact same moment, something far more deliberate, decided not in kitchens or driveways but inside government offices in Westminster. And this next part is where the real structural damage to the small shopkeeper actually begins. In 1964, something happened in British law that most people alive today have never even heard of. And yet it quietly pulled the foundation out from under every small shopkeeper in the country at once. Retail price maintenance was made illegal. Here is what that actually meant, in plain, everyday English. Before 1964, manufacturers were legally allowed to fix the price of their own products, no matter where in the country you bought them. A tin of beans cost exactly the same whether you bought it from a tiny shop on a quiet residential corner or from the largest store in the biggest city. That single rule protected small shopkeepers because it meant they never had to compete on price at all. They competed on relationship, on convenience, on the simple fact that they knew you, and you knew them. The moment that legal protection was removed, the entire game changed, almost overnight. Large retailers, buying in enormous bulk from manufacturers desperate for big orders, could now legally undercut the small shop on price, and they did so relentlessly, store after store, town after town. A corner shop simply could not buy 1,000 tins of beans at anything close to the rate a national chain could buy 100,000. The price war that followed was never a fair fight. It was never designed to be one. This is the part almost nobody tells you when they casually say supermarkets won the British High Street. They did not win because they were loved more by the public. They won because the law itself handed them a weapon the small independent shop could never realistically match, no matter how hard the family behind the counter worked. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, that pressure kept building year after year. More deregulation followed across the retail sector. Trading rules loosened further still. And then in 1994 the Sunday Trading Act passed through Parliament, allowing large stores to open 7 days a week for the first time. Stop and think about what that single piece of legislation actually did to the rhythm of ordinary British life. Sunday used to be the one day the corner shop, very often the only thing open on the entire street, had completely to itself, with no competition whatsoever. After 1994, even that final dependable advantage quietly disappeared. So by the time we reach the 2000s, the numbers tell a story that is almost painful to look at directly. From those 90,000 independent grocery stores standing strong across Britain in 1970, the number had collapsed to somewhere around 36,000 by 2010. That means more than half of them gone, within the span of a single working lifetime, the same lifetime in which someone might have opened their shop as a young man and closed it, defeated, as an old one. Imagine being a shopkeeper who proudly opened your doors in 1970, your own name freshly painted above the entrance, and by the time you finally retired, more than half the people who had once stood beside you in that same trade had already shut their own doors for good, one after another, like dominoes falling slowly across an entire country. But here's the part of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most important turn in the entire history of the British corner shop. While all of this legal and economic pressure was crushing the old-fashioned white working-class shopkeeper model that Britain had known for generations, a completely different group of people were about to walk straight into these dying shops and do something nobody had quite expected. They didn't just save some of them from closing, they reinvented what a corner shop even meant. By the 1960s and 70s, families had begun arriving in Britain from India, from East Africa, particularly from communities expelled from countries like Uganda and Kenya, and later from Eastern Europe as well, looking for a way to build a stable life in a country that wasn't always welcoming to them. Many of these families found their opening in exactly the kind of small shop the big chains were already abandoning. The ones too small, too marginal, too much relentless hard work for anyone else to want to bother with. There's a journalist named Babita Sharma who grew up literally living above a corner shop in Reading, run by her own family, who had arrived from India. She later wrote a book about that experience, and one detail from it captures everything this story is really about. She described how, standing behind that counter day after day, she came to know almost everything about the people of her town, whether they leaned politically left or right, whether their marriage was quietly struggling, whether they could afford small luxuries that week, or were carefully counting out every last penny. That's the part of the corner shop that no spreadsheet, no market share report will ever be able to measure. It wasn't simply a place to buy milk and a newspaper. It was where someone behind a counter genuinely knew your life, week after week, year after year. By the 1980s, roughly half of all local corner shops across Britain were being run by Asian families. Read that figure again slowly. Half. At the precise moment the old, traditional model of the British corner shop was dying under the combined weight of price wars and shifting legislation, an entirely new generation of shopkeepers stepped directly into that gap and kept the lights on through sheer force of will and exhausting hard work. The way they managed it tells you something honest about what survival under pressure actually requires. They worked hours that almost nobody else in Britain was willing to work. Early mornings before the sun came up. Late nights well after most shops had locked their doors. Sundays, even decades before the law finally allowed the big chains to open on Sundays too. The phrase "open all hours" wasn't simply a popular sitcom title people remember fondly today. It was a perfectly literal description of how these families kept their small businesses alive, while almost every force in the market was actively pushing the independent trader toward extinction. Many of these new shopkeepers joined what are known in the trade as symbol groups, buying collectives with names like Lundis and Costcutter, which allowed small independent shops to pool their purchasing power together, so they could finally get supply prices somewhere closer to what the enormous chains were already paying. It was a clever, genuinely hard-won workaround to a system that had been legally tilted against the small trader ever since 1964. So here is the uncomfortable truth sitting quietly underneath this entire story, and it's one worth confronting honestly rather than glossing over. The corner shop, exactly as most people over 50 remember it from childhood. The one with the original British family standing behind the till, was already dying by the 1970s, under pressure from supermarkets and from Parliament itself. What kept the very idea of the corner shop alive into the 80s, the 90s, and well beyond, wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't government support either. It was an entirely new generation of immigrant families who quietly saved an institution that Britain, through its own economic policy, was busy abandoning. That is not always a comfortable fact for people to sit with, especially if their own memories only feature one particular kind of shopkeeper. But it is the documented truth, and the numbers back it up completely, year after year, decade after decade. Now let's talk about exactly what was inside these shops, because the products themselves tell their own story about how British life was actually lived day to day. Sweets sat loose in tall glass jars behind the counter, weighed out by hand into small white paper bags, a halfpenny's worth here, a few pence there, with names like sherbet lemons, blackjacks, and toffos that several generations can still recite from memory without hesitation. With names like sherbet lemons, blackjacks, and toffos that several generations can still recite from memory without hesitation, newspapers arrived early, often before most people had even left for work, and by 1950, national daily newspaper circulation in Britain had reached around 21 million copies a day, equivalent to more than the entire number of households in the country. That newspaper round, walked by local school children earning their first few pence of pocket money, was very often the corner shop's first and most reliable daily transaction. Cigarettes were another enormous part of the trade for decades. Back in 1974, around 45% of British adults smoked, and tobacco sales alone could make up a significant share of a small shop's daily takings. That entire side of the business would later collapse dramatically, smoking rates falling all the way down to under 13% of adults by the 2020s, removing yet another pillar that had once kept these small shops financially viable. If this kind of detailed real history is exactly what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because we are slowly rebuilding an entire forgotten version of Britain, one overlooked institution at a time, and there is a great deal more still to uncover together. Now here's where this story becomes genuinely painful, because the ending isn't nearly as clean or as simple as people assume when they say the corner shop closed down. The real ending is stranger, and in some ways far sadder than that. The corner shop did not simply vanish from British streets the way a department store might vanish, leaving an empty shell behind. If you walk down most high streets in Britain today, you will still see small shops sitting on corners. You will still see bright signage, a fridge of cold drinks by the door, a card payment machine sitting on the counter where a notebook used to lie. By the raw numbers, there are still over 46,000 convenience stores currently operating across the United Kingdom right now, today, in this exact moment. So if the shops themselves are technically still there, what exactly did Britain actually lose along the way? We lost the thing the building itself was never really about in the first place. We lost the shop owner who knew your name, who knew your children's names, who would let you pay tomorrow if you happened to be short of cash today. A practice older shopkeepers used to simply call buying on tick. That particular kind of trust, recorded in a worn little notebook kept under the counter instead of inside a corporate computer system, simply does not exist in the vast majority of these stores anymore. Many of today's so-called corner shops aren't truly independent at all. Walk into what looks at first glance like a classic small local store, and there's a very real chance you're actually standing inside a Sainsbury's local or a Tesco branded carefully as one stop. The large supermarket chains, having spent more than 50 years systematically dismantling the independent shopkeeper through price wars and sustained deregulation, eventually realized something important about human nature. People still deeply miss the feeling of the corner shop, even while happily shopping at the supermarket for everything else. So the chains built their own polished imitations of it, carefully designed to look small, local, and personal, while every single decision made inside that building is still dictated by the exact same corporate headquarters that helped crush the originals in the first place. That is the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you, once you actually sit with it. The corner shop, as a feeling, as a thread of community connection, was killed off gradually across 50 years of legislation and relentless supermarket expansion. And then the very companies most responsible for killing it went on to build a convincing costume that looks almost identical to it, and sold that costume right back to the public as convenience. If you grew up with a real one, a genuine independently owned corner shop, you know the difference instantly. The moment you walk through either door, you know that a man behind a counter, who has personally watched you grow up across 20 years, is simply not the same thing as a part-time employee, quietly following a regional manager's display guidelines from a head office 200 miles away. One of those relationships is real. The other is a transaction wearing a familiar comforting coat. Let's talk for a moment about something the tobacco display ban of 2015 reveals about this slower second wave of decline, because it shows how the pressure on small shopkeepers never really stopped. It simply changed shape over time. That law required shops to hide cigarettes from open view, ending decades of cigarettes being stacked proudly behind the till as one of a small shop's most reliable high-margin products. Within just a few years afterward, tobacco-related shopping baskets at convenience stores had fallen by around 47% between 2018 and 2021 alone, for thousands of small independent shops still surviving into the 2010s. That single regulatory change quietly removed one of the last remaining financial pillars still holding many of them upright. Meanwhile, something else was creeping in from a completely different direction. Online shopping and home delivery slowly began doing to the supermarket what the supermarket had once done to the corner shop. Why drive anywhere at all, when an entire week's groceries could simply arrive at your front door instead? Convenience itself kept evolving, kept becoming more frictionless, leaving each previous version of convenient looking slower and more old-fashioned by comparison, including the supermarkets that had once seemed so unstoppable themselves. This is also a good moment to genuinely pause and ask yourself something honest, something worth sitting with for a minute rather than rushing past. Do you remember the actual name of the person who ran your local corner shop when you were growing up? If you do remember it, say that name out loud in the comments below right now. Tell us where that shop stood. Exactly. On which street. In which town. Tell us what it sold. What it smelled like the moment you pushed the door open. Whether it was sweets and damp newspaper, or fresh bread, or simply dust and old wood. These memories matter far more than people tend to realize. And frankly, they are disappearing faster than most of us would like to admit, as the generation who lived through that world quietly grows smaller every single year. Let's bring this entire story all the way back now to that little bell above the door we started with. What that bell actually represented was never really the shop itself. It represented a kind of unwritten social contract that used to exist inside British communities without anyone ever putting a single word of it down on paper. You went in most days, not necessarily because you urgently needed something, but because going in was simply part of how your day was structured. The same way getting the post or hearing the milk float pass by structured it too. You knew exactly who would be standing behind that counter. They knew roughly what time you'd appear. If you happened to be a few pence short one week, they trusted that you'd come back and settle it properly the following week, because that was simply how things worked between neighbors who actually knew each other. None of that quiet trust ever shows up in a quarterly earnings report. None of it shows up on a market share graph sitting inside some corporate boardroom presentation. But it was entirely real, and it mattered enormously to the people living through it. And an entire country quietly let it slip away while looking in the opposite direction, distracted by lower prices, longer opening hours, and the sheer convenience of buying absolutely everything under one single enormous roof. Here's the lesson sitting quietly underneath 50 years of British retail history, and it's genuinely worth sitting with for a moment, rather than simply nodding along and moving on. Efficiency and community are not actually the same thing. And very often, uncomfortably often, they end up working directly against one another. The supermarket model that ultimately won this long fight gave Britain cheaper food, far greater choice, and dramatically longer opening hours. Nobody sensible is pretending that counts for nothing. But it took something else away in the trade, something nobody ever properly put a price on until it was already gone for good. The everyday, low-stakes human contact that used to be quietly built into something as ordinary as buying a single pint of milk on your way home. And perhaps the most important thing to understand, after everything we've walked through together, is this. Nobody made one single deliberate decision that killed off the British corner shop. There was no clear villain who sat down, signed a piece of paper, and ended it there and then. It was death by 1,000 small, perfectly reasonable-sounding choices made by ordinary people and ordinary institutions across 5 decades. A new law here, removing one small protection. A fridge installed there, quietly changing a household's weekly rhythm. A few pence shaved off the price of beans somewhere else, completely legally. Each individual decision made perfect sense entirely on its own terms. Added all together, across 50 long years, they slowly erased something that Britain itself never quite got the chance to properly vote on losing. If there's one honest lesson worth carrying away from all of this, it's that the things which actually hold a community together rarely look especially important while they're still sitting right there in front of us, on every street corner, every single day. They only start to look important the very moment they're finally gone, and by then you genuinely cannot simply rebuild them from scratch. You cannot legislate trust back into existence through Parliament. You cannot subsidize a shopkeeper into truly knowing your name again, the way one once did, year after year, without ever needing to ask. So if this video brought back a memory just now, a particular smell, a face behind a counter you haven't actually thought about in years, please don't let that feeling pass by quietly. Leave a comment below and tell us properly about it. Hit like on this video if any part of it genuinely meant something to you while watching. Share it directly with someone else who would remember that very same shop, that very same street, and subscribe to this channel, because there is so much more of this disappearing Britain still waiting to be uncovered together, and we are only just getting started on this journey.